Good evening and welcome. Let's take a look at our top story this hour. The European Union member countries have finally approved a list of 15 countries considered as safe amid the coronavirus pandemic. European Union officials have been racing for days to agree on who can visit the bloc as of the 1st of July. The decisions are based on how countries of origin are faring with new coronavirus cases. Countries included in the list are Canada, Australia, South Korea, Japan and Morocco. The safe country list would be reviewed every 14 days, with new countries being added and some possibly dropping off, depending on how the spread of the disease is being managed. India is not on the list since the number of cases are still on the rise, with the total cases at more than 560,000. India is still far from fully controlling the pandemic. India is one of the most important tourist markets for Europe, with over 10 million Indians traveling to Europe every year. That number was expected to grow to 15 million in 2020. According to figures available, more than 900,000 applications for Schengen visas were submitted by Indians in 2017. Americans are excluded, depending on the coronavirus statistics and how the country has managed the spread of the disease. Now, that prospect, which would lump American visitors as unwelcome, is a stinging blow to American prestige in the world, which has over 2.3 million cases and upward of 120,000 deaths, which is more than any other country. Infection rates in Brazil and Russia are high, and their nationals also couldn't make the cut. Meanwhile, China will be added to the safe list, but under the condition that Beijing do the same for Europeans. Our correspondent, Benji Haya, joins us live from London. Good evening to you, Benji. The EU working to agree on who can visit the bloc. We believe this list has been finalised. And based on this, the countries of origin are faring with the new coronavirus cases. Take us through this in terms of requirements and stipulations.
Yes, this list just recently confirmed by the European Union, and the reason it's taken so long is because the number of discrepancies and differences between the countries and their preferences. You had the likes of Spain that had been devastated by COVID-19, who obviously thrive when it comes to tourism, but were much more wary about opening up borders, versus the likes of Portugal and Greece, who have had their spikes of coronavirus in recent weeks, but rely heavily on visitors from countries around the world to sustain their tourism industry, and were therefore very keen to open up. And there was also nations like France who pushed for that reciprocal agreement with China, with the EU confirming that China will only be allowed on that list if European Union citizens can also visit China as well. But the list now concluded, at least for the next 2 weeks, as you say, and that means that the countries that are excluded from the list, the likes of the United States or China or Brazil or Russia, could be added at a later date. It just depends on the amount of coronavirus cases that those countries are experiencing. An interesting case is the United Kingdom, of course, because the UK is out of the European Union. Brexit happened back in January, but it is still being treated in the same way as other European Union countries. So citizens in Britain have the same rights when it comes to travel as other EU citizens. There are still some restrictions around the continent, the Schengen zone, where mostly people could travel freely between 26 or so nations. That freedom of travel has been a little more compromised, of course, by the virus, and there have been things like quarantines put in for those arriving from other countries. But the UK is in negotiations with other European states to try and get rid of those quarantine rules, put in sort of air bridges with the likes of France or Spain or Turkey perhaps, therefore allowing people to fly to Spain for their holidays, not have to quarantine upon arrival, and then not quarantine when they get back to the UK. So it's all part of trying to stimulate the economy once again, but also remaining wary of the threat of coronavirus, and that's why countries such as the United States and China haven't made it onto that safe list yet.
Right, and you did touch on this earlier. It is expected that this safe countries list will then, is this expected to be reciprocated by the other countries? And what will the effects on bilateral relations be between these countries then?
Between the European Union, well, yes, it's interesting, the relationships in the EU. It's seen as a bloc that's supposed to have unity. Very often it doesn't. There were, as I say, some differences in opinion about what should happen. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, although we have this list now of 14 countries plus China, it is all subject to change. It completely depends on what happens with coronavirus cases, not just outside the European Union, but inside as well. And then in terms of relationships with other countries such as the United States or China, we haven't got a reaction yet from, say, the Trump administration or from Beijing. You would think that they want to try to be on this list, of course, but the only way they're going to be allowed to is to bring down their coronavirus cases. Same applies to Russia or indeed India. And so if Donald Trump has seen this and noticed that the United States isn't on that list, then he'll know that the way to try to get Americans back into Europe for their summer holidays is to bring down the risk of coronavirus in his own country.
Right, now the safe country list is to be reviewed bi-weekly. Isn't 2 weeks quite a long time period for this kind of review?
Well, that was the time period that was agreed upon. I think, if you go every couple of days, then it's very difficult for people to commit to things like summer holidays or business trips. If you decide to make that period a month, then you're right, it could turn out to be too long. So 2 weeks is seen as sort of that middle ground where it gives enough time for holidaymakers to say, I can enjoy my trip to a certain country, knowing that I'll be permitted there, but not long enough for cases to spiral out of control. This sort of thing, you have to remember, is unprecedented. We've rarely ever had something like this happen before. It's a total shock to the system. So what the EU is doing here is unprecedented, and I think they'll have to be malleable and flexible when it comes to arrangements. If, for example, there are massive spikes from countries that do feature on the list, say Australia or New Zealand has cases once again, then of course they're going to have to adjust and they're going to have to change the requirements. And they may do so before that 2 week cut-off. I think that they just almost have to set an arbitrary date to say we have to commit to this and we have to focus on this in order to try and get some sort of stability back into tourism, back into flights, back into business.
Benji.